back today with another piece of my capsule wardrobe project. Today I'm going to be working on the yellow skirt and blouse. I have the fabric here. It has been already washed, so go me. I think I'm going to start with the skirt first, just in case I don't have enough to make the blouse, because I actually want the skirt more than the blouse part. So if we don't have enough for the blouse, that's a-okay. Let's get started with the skirt.
So for the skirt pattern, this is basically what I'm planning. I'm going to lay out my fabric on the floor because I'm a very professional person. And I'm going to basically cut a triangle thusly, and then one of them will be cut on the fold, one of them will not. So I'll have 3 pieces and then repeat that twice. And then when I assemble the skirt pieces, I'll have the big triangle and then kind of flip it so all the skinny sides line up and all the wider ends line up. So you're kind of left with this, you know, times 2 again. And then I'm going to just gather down along the waistline. So this will be a little bit of a fuller skirt, not my usual circle skirt. And to complete the pockets and everything, instead of a button front closure or a zipper or anything, so once the skirt is assembled and there will be seams down the front, I'm planning to sew in my pockets the exact same way I normally do, except I'm just going to do a button here and here and here and here, and have some buttons down the side as well. And then there will still be a pocket opening here. And then that's how you'll get in and out of the skirt as well. So it's a multi-purpose thing. So that is the plan. Let's do all that stuff. As promised, I laid my fabric out on the fold. I measured how long I wanted the skirt to be and cut straight across the fabric at that point. Then I just eyeballed where to cut the diagonal line. I ended up making the tops of the triangles too narrow, which we'll deal with later. This means the waistline didn't have to be gathered in the end, but it still worked out fine. I repeated the process a second time and was left with 6 skirt pieces. I pinned the skirt segments together along the long edges, making sure to pair the bias edge of the wide piece with the straight edge of the narrow pieces. This helps prevent warping on the bias. The pieces would be sewn together with French seams to protect the raw edges. I sewed everything with wrong sides together first, which on this fabric was difficult to tell, so any old side will do. I then trimmed the seam allowances to about 5 millimeters, flipped and ironed them flat, then sewed them again to finish the seam. This was repeated for all the skirt segments on the front and back pieces, but not at the side seams yet. I've sewn together the skirt pieces for the front and back panels, and I think I cut the skinny edge of the triangle way too thin because now the skirt is not wide enough for my waist, definitely not wide enough to need to be gathered down. So I'm gonna have to just cut a little bit off at the top, which is totally fine. I have enough length at the bottom to work with, and then, you know, it'll be a wider waist, and then I can start putting everything together. That's what happens when you're just willy-nilly cutting stuff up. I used a skirt that already fits well to determine the required length and shape for the waistline, then traced and cut it out, adding a bit of room for seam allowance. Then it was time for pockets. I used my previously drafted pocket pattern and cut out 4 pieces so I'd have enough for 2 pockets, adding seam allowance around the edges. However, I didn't add any at the top of the pocket because I've used this pattern a bunch and I know they're too long if I add any extra seam allowance. Then it was time to add the pockets to the sides of the skirt. I used my usual method of French seaming them on. First, pin and sew the pocket pieces to the skirt pieces with wrong sides together. Trim the seam allowance and snip into the seam allowance just below the pocket so you can flip the pieces around and iron them flat. Stitch this seam down and you have the first French seam, which is ironed towards the pocket bag. Then the skirt pieces are laid on top of each other, again with wrong sides together. Pin and sew around the edge of the pocket and down the length of the skirt side seam. Once again, the seam allowance is trimmed and the pieces are flipped inside out so the right sides are now facing each other. Press and stitch again, and the French seam pockets are now mostly complete. The skirt is largely assembled at this point. All the seams, are sewn. All the pockets, both pockets are sewn in, and I have just pinned the skirt closed at the sides. But I'm at a tricky point now, because at this point, if it were a regular skirt, I would sew the pockets into the waistband and then sew on the waistband. Because I want the side to open, I think my plan was to have like a front waistband and a back waistband and then kind of, button it here. But that's not going to work because the pockets are pretty much just one piece inside. So I don't know what to do. So I think I'm gonna just stop and do some soul searching, and we'll come back to it when I know how to proceed. It's been about 10 seconds, but I had a thought, and that is that I could just make a waistband and extend it to include this bit of pocket, and then everything would just get folded on itself. But that would be bulky because it would have 2 pocket layers and then the waistband and the overlap of the skirt. So that might be way too bulky, but that might be what I do anyway, because otherwise I have no idea. That seems like a good start. Let's try it. Me again. I've also just thought that because I'm pretty sure only one side is going to have to open, because it's going to be roomy enough with just one side, so I can just make the regular waistband and then do the tucked waistband on one side, add faux buttons or just no buttons on the side that won't open, and working buttons on the other side. That sounds good. Let's do that. For the side that wouldn't need to open, I stitched the pocket opening closed a bit, leaving enough space for my hand to fit through and back stitching at the openings. Now it was on to the waistband. I used a technique I learned from Bernadette Banner for cutting an on-grain piece of linen called drawing a thread, which seems really tedious at first, but I actually love it now. Basically, after determining how wide you want your waistband to be, you pull out a thread with a pin and then just continue easing it out of the fabric. If the thread snaps, you can find it again pretty easily, ease it out with the pin again, and continue merrily on your way. This creates a gap in the weave and gives you a perfectly straight line to cut along. I really do find this process quite fun. It's almost like a challenge or a game to see how long you can pull the thread without it breaking, and it's so satisfying at the end when you can pull the thread out with no resistance. It's easier with lighter weight linens, but is definitely possible with heavier weights like this one. With the waistband cut out, I pinned and sewed it to the top of the skirt, overlapping it inside the pocket that will act as the closure to hide the seam. It was at this point that I realized a common flaw in my skirts is that I always forget to add interfacing to the waistband, so I added some now. I like my interfacing to be the size of the finished waistband, i.e. with no seam allowance so it's less bulky, so I cut it smaller than the fabric piece and ironed it in. It would have been way easier to remember to do this before sewing it to the skirt, but what can you do? Learn from my mistakes. With the interfacing ironed in, I could carry on with finishing the waistband. I folded it over once towards the skirt and then a second time to hide the raw edges. I pinned everything down and everything would be finished with a whip stitch, although you could certainly top stitch it instead. Now it was time for buttons. I made sure the waist fit nice and snugly but still comfortably, then marked where I wanted the buttonholes to be with a heat erasable pen. I marked 5 here, but I only ended up needing 4 buttons. I've finished sewing the buttons and the buttonholes, and I just have the skirt hanging on my dress form so that it can stretch out at all, and then tomorrow I can finish the hem and she's done. To level the skirt, I placed pins at the bottom at an equal height all the way around, then trimmed off the excess. Then I could fold up the bottom edge twice and whip stitch it in place, and the skirt was complete. I'm pretty happy with how this skirt turned out. I think this method lets you use less fabric than a circle skirt, but the hem is still nice and full. Granted, there's more seaming to do, but they're all straight seams, so it's not more complicated necessarily, just slightly more time consuming. The pocket and button closure turned out great, but the opposite side of the pocket at the waistband tends to droop a little bit, so I plan on adding a snap or hook and eye there to help support it. I didn't end up making the matching bodice for this, mostly because the yellow on its own is pretty bright and I feel like together it would just be too much yellow. So that is everything. We are so close to the end of this capsule wardrobe project. In fact, all the pieces are now done. I just have to get off my ass and finish editing the videos. Why am I like this? Subscribe for more sewing content to come, and I'll see you next time. Spinning under an apple tree, be like.